Greetings and welcome to episode 36 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation. Now, in the last episode, we heard how Joshua dies. He gathers all of the people together, recalls all of the great things that God had done for them, and they followed God pretty good. I mean, they were pretty good in their discipleship. Things were going pretty good. And at the beginning of Judges, which is the seventh book of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Moses dies. Joshua, the sixth book. Judges is the seventh book of the Bible. And Joshua dies at the beginning of Judges chapter 1. And things are going pretty good. Judges chapter 2 reads this way. After that, the whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, that is, they all died. And then another generation grew up who did not know the Lord, nor what he had done for Israel. Remember at the beginning of Exodus, there was Exodus 1 verse 8. Then arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. It's the same type of cataclysmic verse. After all the old people died, there rose up a new generation who did not know the Lord, nor what he had done for Egypt. So this whole new generation lost their story, okay? They lost their story. They had no clue about God's intent to bring them out, to bring them back, and in their lives as they went about things, they lost their bearings. They lost their sense of purpose and identity. They lost their story about how God had brought them out. They forgot why God put them on this green earth in the first place and reminded them to love God and love another. Now, that's what happens when you lose your bearings. You lose your sense of direction. You make up a new story for yourself, which ends up not being good in terms of loving God and loving your neighbor. Instead, you make up a story for yourself where you are at the center and your focus becomes about yourself, finding ways in which you can do things that will be good for you. You begin to neglect God and neglect other people. When you do that, when you make up a whole new story for yourself, what you do is live in the absence of God. That's what happens in the book of Judges. What we see there, in fact, a cycle that happens again and again, because then in Judges, it's also written, then the people of Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the people around them. They became assimilated into the culture around them, the pagan culture around them. That sentence gets repeated again and again in Judges, that the people did what was right in their eyes, but not in the eyes of the Lord. Notice two sets of eyes here. There's God's eyes, love God, love your neighbor. What was right in the people's eyes was doing the opposite of that. Forsake God, forsake caring about other people. And that's what happens again and again. In Judges chapter 2, we read these words. The people of Israel who turned against God, aroused God's anger, and the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around when they were no longer able to resist. When Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Now, Judges is the seventh book of the Bible. And what's key to understanding what's happening in Judges was that as a result of their disobedience, they lost their story. They had taken possession of the promised land at this point, and God was still committed to them. God never abandoned them because it's not God's purpose and plan to abandon God's people. Further, in Judges chapter 2, we read, Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the lands of these raiders. And so begins a cycle that runs 7 times through the book of Judges. 7 times. The people did evil, God punished them, they cried out, and God answered over and over and over again. 7 times for 300 years of the time of the Judges. That's longer than the United States of America has existed. 300 years, 7 cycles, 7 judges. Now, the first judge was Othniel at the beginning of Judges chapter 3. Othniel was a younger brother of Caleb. Remember Caleb who said, I want the mountain, that we've talked about before. Caleb was one of the 2 spies who entered the promised land 40 years before. Othniel was Caleb's younger brother. In fact, the word Othniel means lion of God. And things went well for a while, but then the people rebelled and the cycle started again. Rebellion and then God judging them. They repented and God restored them. That cycle happens 7 times in the book of Judges. Then the second judge in Judges chapter 3 is an interesting guy. Now, we read this about him. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because of this, the evil the Lord gave them, God gave them over to the evil king Moab. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, that is, repented, and he gave them a deliverer, a second judge, Ehud, a left-handed man. Ehud, a left-handed man. Now, any of y'all left-handed? I mean, now we know that that's perfectly normal. In fact, those of us who are married to a spouse who was left-handed have come to know that scientific research has shown us that those who are left-handed are, as a whole, better looking, they're more intelligent, they're better at decisions, and in general are just better people than those of us who are right-handed. So, there you go. Now, back in the Old Testament times, about 300 years ago, in the period of the Judges, being left-handed was a little suspect. Being left-handed was seen as a flaw, as a weakness. So, why is it mentioned? Ehud. It says right in Judges, a left-handed man. Well, because often God used what they consider to be a flawed, imperfect human being to accomplish God's will. In fact, Ehud used his left-handedness to accomplish God's purpose. Now, listen to this. Right there in the Bible, 3rd chapter of Judges. Ehud was raised up by God to be a judge during the time when Elgon, the evil king of the Moabites, was in power, and the people of Israel were oppressed by him for 18 years. So Ehud, in Judges chapter 3, took a small double-edged sword and attached it to his right thigh underneath his clothes, right? That was important because the vast majority of soldiers in that time kept their weapons, since they're right-handed, on their left leg, which is easier to draw out with their right hands. And so Ehud goes to see Elgon, the evil king of the Moabites. And what you need to know is that Elgon, the evil king of the Moabites, was a big man. I mean, he was a fat man, okay? He was, in fact, in Judges 3:17, it says that King Elgon was a very extremely fat man. And when Ehud the judge went to speak to the evil King Elgon in private, he drew his sword with his left hand where Elgon wasn't expected it, and it stabbed it into the king's stomach. And reading from the Bible, even the handle of the knife sank in after the blade which came out his back. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat of Elgon closed in over it. You thought the Bible was boring. It's not. So Ehud, after stabbing fat old King Elgon in the belly and it going all the way through the back, and then he couldn't pull it out because it went so far in. After Ehud had gone, the servants of Elgon came and found the upper room locked. They said, he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the house, so they waited to the point of embarrassment. So here's Ehud, who stabs the big fat man with the sword that goes so far in that he can't pull it out, and then slips out the back door, and the servants of the king are standing there thinking, he's in the bathroom and he must be so constipated, that's why he's taking so long. So they think he's just on a porcelain throne, so they just wait outside. After they found King Elgon dead, Ehud and the people of Israel attacked the people of Moab and conquered them, and the people of Israel were free again, and life was pretty good. Life was pretty good for a while, until they rebelled, were put in captivity, and the cycle started all over again. Deborah was also one of the judges. She was a woman in a very patriarchal society dominated by men. During her time as a judge, some tribes didn't follow her because, after all, she's a woman, so they didn't want to follow a woman. But there's another time with Deborah when her army commander was so impressed with her that he insists that she go with him into battle. He says to Deborah, you don't go with me, I ain't going. So he doesn't care if she's a woman or not. He trusts her leadership and the fact that God was with her. That's pretty significant in the line of Old Testament patriarchy. Deborah was one of the few good women who followed God's will and way in leadership. Women weren't in leadership at that time for the people of Israel. During Deborah's reign as judge, the enemy king at the time was killed by Jael, Jael, who's another woman, while the enemy king hides in her tent. While that enemy king was sleeping, Jael takes a tent stake and drives it with a hammer into his head. So here's two heroes in the book of Judges that are both women. In our culture, we wouldn't bat an eye at, well, you would bat an eye if a woman or anybody drives a tent stake into your head. But God used people like Deborah and Jael and Ehud, people who were outside the box, to accomplish God's will. So the book of Judges covers about 300 years during during those time, people of Israel were under siege and oppression by the Mesopotamians, the Moabites, the Canaanites, the Midianites, the Amorites, and the Philistines. The cycle continued, and God kept on raising up judges to rule over them. We're going to talk about Gideon in the next episode, and Samson, two of the judges who were in that cycle. God continued his relentless pursuit to get them back. God did not abandon them, even though they did what was right in their eyes instead of what was right in God's eyes. And even though some of the judges messed up, still they continued God's story. Even though they rebelled, but they repented and they were restored. So the story continues with judges, one after the other, 300-year cycle. God still uses imperfect people, as we are, to accomplish God's will. And God is always on the lookout for people who will work with God to accomplish God's purposes. It is a time to make it a great day. It's a time to be grateful. It's a time to smile, simply smile at people and see what that blesses you with. Look forward to being with you in the next episode. And until then, just make it a great day. See you later. Bye-bye.